reunification of the Korean Peninsula. Today this afternoon we're going to be talking about the Trilateral Alliance, very important and absolutely pivotal to security in Northeast Asia. For decades, Japan and South Korea have faced common threats, and they have jointly cooperated in a fast-growing economy for both countries. But there's always been an unease in the background, and sometimes it will even come into the foreground because it goes back to the colonialization period, and even back before World War II. There's a lot of water under the bridge, but even as common rivals with North Korea and China become more formidable, those rivalries, there's still a need to be aware of the common defense, because a weakening of cooperation could have severe ramifications for a sudden crisis. So in South Korea's a major catalyst in recent years of this animosity was in 2018, when the Supreme Court of South Korea ruled that the Nippon Steel Corporation had to pay compensation for South Koreans forced to work in his factories during the Japanese colonialization. But Northeast Asia is a tough neighborhood, and tensions remain high even now. Japan and South Korea both have incentives to cooperate with the United States and one another to prepare for contingencies on the in that whole region. All three countries want to mitigate the North Korean threat and create some bulwark against the rise of China. But to ensure a coordinated response to these challenges, the United States, South Korea, and Japan need to improve their ability to cooperate in many joint efforts. We're very happy to have with us this afternoon, I'm very happy, two gentlemen who both go back a long way with both countries and have a great affinity for Japan and Korea. We were also given a videotape from the former Vice Minister of Unification of Korea. He was in the headlines a great deal during 2016, 2017 when he was Vice Minister of that ministry, but he worked there for 30 years. Is well known, participated as a representative in the Inter-Korean Summit, and today he's in the private sector as chairman of the Institute of Inter-Korean Social Integrations and also a university professor. So we're happy to have a video from him, and I'm going to start with that so that our two gentlemen that we have live with us today can incorporate that into their comments if we want. So EJ, if you would please roll that video.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Hyunjo Kim from South Korea. First of all, congratulations on the opening of ILC organized by UPF. And I'd like to give my thanks to all the people who works for the peace on the Korean Peninsula. Especially special thanks to Dr. Walsh and Dr. Jenkins. Generally speaking, Korea and Japan are close and distant, geographically close but emotionally distant due to the historical scars. There are conflict issues between Korea and Japan, such as comfort to women and forced labor. But there are cooperative issues, such as tourism, trade, and cultural exchanges. In particular, the Korean Peninsula problem is the key factor for South Korea and Japan to cooperate each other in terms of security and prosperity. North Korea is fundamentally hostile to Japan as it uses anti-Japanese partisan activities as the cause of its rule. But it is also taking a pragmatic approach using a pro-North Korea organization, 조총련. North Korean leader Kim Jong-un's mother is known as a Japanese-born North Korean. Whenever there is a move to improve relations between North Korea and Japan, the issue of huge compensation for Japanese colonial rule is raised. Although North Korea is emphasizing self-reliance, it will be difficult for North Korea to give up the so-called Japan card easily, hoping for economic construction in difficult conditions. For Japan, the North Korean issue is not something that can be ignored. North Korea's military threats are a security threat to Japan. Japan also needs to promote new economic growth vitality by improving relations with North Korea. So, while Japan has a strong stance on North Korea's nuclear weapons and missiles, it is actively seeking dialogue with North Korea by raising the issue of Japanese abductees. Both former Prime Minister Abe and current Prime Minister Suga have expressed their willingness to meet with Kim Jong-un at any time. South Korea and Japan have basically maintained a cooperative relationship in dealing with the North Korean issue. Based on the ROK-US-Japan alliance, efforts have been made to bring about change in North Korea, such as sharing information about North Korea and jointly responding to North Korean military threats. In particular, South Korea and Japan have jointly responded to the North Korean issue within the framework of multilateral dialogue. In the mid-1990s, South Korea and Japan, along with the United States and the European Union, participated in the Korean Peninsula Energy Development Organization, so-called KIDOR, which was established in accordance with the Geneva Agreement between the US and North Korea. At this time, the representative of six parties, the Korea and Japan representatives, are seeking a common understanding of the North Korean issue and mutual cooperation together. Korea-Japan relations will not be able to move forward if they are immersed in past problems. It is important to solve past problems on the basis of historical facts and universal values, and to cooperate in a future-oriented way for the common development and prosperity of the two countries. South Korea and Japan will actively cooperate in bringing the era of peace and prosperity on the Korean Peninsula as the regime of North Korea's Kim Jong-un changes to an open system to the international community like China and Vietnam. Thanks for listening my explanation.
Dr. Hyunjo Kim, former Vice Minister of Unification. I thought his approach was pretty even-handed considering many of the comments I've heard in Korea directed toward Japan. So I'm glad he gave that testimony. I wish we had someone from the Japanese Diet. I wish we had a video from the Japanese Diet. We weren't able to get one, but we do have two gentlemen on this panel who have a great affinity for both countries and tremendous knowledge and experience in both Japan and Korea. So they will offer our balanced approach. We're going to start with Mr. Bruce Klinger, who is the longtime senior research fellow for Northeast Asia at the Heritage Foundation. He has a background with Central Intelligence. He's also he's called in to testify at some periodically before Congress on various issues as House Foreign Affairs Committee and things like that. and the Senate Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. He is a frequent commentator on U.S. media, and his articles and commentary have appeared in every major publication, including the Washington Times. He's a regular guest when something happens over in Asia. He will be sought out for interviews. He was a CIA deputy chief and then promoted to the chief in Korea. During the time of the nuclear crisis in 1994, when we came just almost as close as we have come to getting physical with North Korea. They had just set down their Yongbyon reactor and had a lot of spent fuel rods on their hands and enough to make half a dozen nuclear weapons. And the IAEA, International Atomic Energy Commission, energy agency, was looking at trying to get sanctions from the UN, and Clinton sent extra troops to Korea, and fingers were moving closer to the trigger on both sides. And Bruce Klinger was there with a front row seat at the whole thing. So he's been involved. He has a lot of contemporary history going on with the Northeast Asia region. So Bruce, we're very happy to have you with us. Welcome.
Well, thank you very much, Larry, and thank you to the organizers for having me. I always enjoy discussing Korean and Japanese issues. When we talk about the relationship between and amongst the US, Japan, and Korea, we're really talking about the leg of that triangle, the very poor relations between Tokyo and Seoul. And I'll get to that. But to take a step back for a moment, and the relationship the US right now has between or with each of our critically important Northeast Asian allies. Right now, the relationship is very good. We had very successful summit meetings in April and May with President Biden, with Prime Minister Suga of Japan, and then Moon Jae-in, the president of South Korea. That was very welcome. During the Trump administration, we had very strained relations with our allies, and that was for a number of reasons. President Trump had a very transactional view of alliances, very different from the traditional bipartisan view that Washington had of that our alliances are critically important. They help us achieve our strategic objectives, and they're based on shared values and principles. President Trump saw them much more transactionally and often used very strong derogatory language toward our allies. And most contentious was during what's called special measures agreement negotiations, where we seek a compensation for a portion of the cost of stationing our forces overseas. President Trump was trying to make a profit off of our sons and daughters stationed overseas, seeking a 400% and 500% increase from our Japanese and South Korean allies. So once we abandoned that and went back to a traditional incremental increase in offsetting the cost of our forces, the relations got a lot better. So right now we have a very positive future. Now, looking at the difficult relations between Seoul and Tokyo, the causes for it go back centuries. And some would fear we're never going to solve that. The best we can do is ameliorate it enough that we can move it to the back burner so that we can focus on the threats of this millennium rather than rehashing the events of the last millennium. So the current round of what is often a cyclical up and down roller coaster of improvements and degradations in relations was by the Moon administration walking away from the Comfort Women Agreement of December 2015, and then the Supreme Court ruling that Larry talked about. And then that led to retaliatory export controls by Tokyo against important minerals going and products going to South Korea, and that led Seoul to threaten to withdraw from a military and intelligence sharing agreement with Tokyo, all of which were all very unhelpful and very counterproductive. So as we go right now, both countries say they want to improve relations, but it's always a case of, but the other country has to do X, Y, and Z first. So under the Obama administration, there was a lot of behind the scenes, often very stern private messages to both of our allies. And that led to at least an improvement in the relations to enable the Comfort Women Agreement. It wasn't perfect, but at least it partially resolved that very difficult and very emotional and very contentious issue. As we had the flare up during the last several years, the Trump administration often took a hands-off approach, seen as it was up to Seoul and Tokyo to resolve their differences. Under the Biden administration, we're not sure what their approach will be or what has been, but it's very likely they're going to take a more hands-on approach because many of the people in the Obama administration are back for the Biden administration, including Biden himself. Then Vice President Biden took a personal involvement, and he helped broker the first summit meeting between South Korean President Park Geun-hye and Japanese Prime Minister Abe. And then Tony Blinken, who's now Secretary of State, and Kurt Campbell, who's now the Asia coordinator at the National Security Council, all were very much involved. So I think we're going to have more of a U.S. involvement, which is good. We should be involved, but we shouldn't appear to take a judge position or an arbiter of which side is right, because really there are errors on both sides and counterproductive behavior by both countries. So I think as the Obama administration did, we should play a behind the scenes role. We often will have to give very strong messages to both of our allies to try to prod them towards a repairing, if not resolution of the issues. So, quite frankly, we cannot defend South Korea without Japan. Not only the 7 UN command rear bases that we have access to during a crisis, but we're going to need access to other bases for the large throughput of US forces that would be going into the peninsula for any kind of crisis. And what I've tried to make clear to my Korean friends is that if the relations between Seoul and Tokyo are poor, Tokyo may say, why should I risk a nuclear attack on Tokyo and other parts of Japan to help a country that has very poor relations with Japan? So it's in Korea's best interest to have good relations with Japan. Obviously, both countries need to take steps to try to push aside and treat in parallel the history issues from the issues of today. One example is where South Korea has refused to integrate its ballistic missile defense system into the more comprehensive, the more effective allied system, including the United States and Japan, because of the history issues. That's like a baseball coach telling his 3 outfielders, I don't want you talking to each other. Well, anyone who's played baseball knows that if your outfielders are talking to each other, they all have a different viewpoint on a high fly ball. The center fielder may feel he's going to catch it, and the other 2 fielders will know that it's going over his head. So if you have the 3 outfielders or the 3 countries talking to each other, you're more likely to catch the fly ball or intercept the missile, perhaps nuclear tipped. So that's one area where we should have greater cooperation. As we look to the future, there's not a lot of optimism right now. Some will point to the fact that President Moon only has a year left in his constitutionally restricted 1 5-year term. And some have suggested that Tokyo would say, well, why don't we wait for the next leader? Well, a year from now, Tokyo or Seoul may say, well, the current or future Japanese leader may only be in office for a short time, so why bother? And that could just kick the can further and further down the road. What we need to do, and what the US should be doing behind the scene, is emphasizing that we're facing common security threats, not only from North Korea, but from China. And we need to work together on that security situation. So not only the direct military threat, but what we've also seen from China is increasingly assertive, belligerent, intimidating behavior in the South China Sea, the East China Sea, intimidation of Taiwan, and then unfair or illegal business practices, and also very terrible human rights violations against the Uyghur minority in Xinjiang province, as well as in Hong Kong. So what we saw in both the US summits with Japan and South Korea was calling out China for their behavior. Now, Prime Minister Suga then took the next step and identified China as the perpetrator of these heinous actions. Moon Jae-in didn't cross that line. He would condemn China's behavior, but then was reluctant to name China as the perpetrator. So what we need to do is have a greater solidarity, not only amongst the 3 nations, but in conjunction with other democracies in Asia, because we're all stronger together than we are separately. So to get a common framework of agreement and working together on security, as well as other issues, not only security challenges, but other economic and health issues throughout Asia, we need to try to do what we can to improve relations between Seoul and Tokyo, not only for issues in Northeast Asia, but really throughout Asia. So I thank you for the opportunity to speak before you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Bruce. Our next speaker, and then we'll open it up to Q&A and take questions. If you have any questions, please just plop them in the Q&A window or the chat window anytime during the presentations. Our next speaker is Mr. Greg Scarlett, who is Executive Director of the Committee for Human Rights in North Korea. He's also a visiting professor at Hankuk University of Foreign Studies. Thing that I find most interesting is he's an instructor and a coordinator of the Korean Peninsula and Japan class at the U.S. State Department, where he teaches a joint seminar on Japan and Korea, the culture, history, economics, politics, relations with the U.S., to foreign service officers who are about to go overseas. Now, I have a lot of experience with Korean. I'm married to Japanese, and I have seen that the two cultures make each other as crazy as the French and Germans make each other. And yet, like the French and Germans, they're very close in proximity. And I'm always amazed how that can turn out. Mr. Scarlett is a member of the advisory board of the Korean World Politics Institute. And prior to being with Human Rights Committee for Human Rights in North Korea, he was with the Korea Economic Institute in Washington, which is now currently headed up by Dr. Kathleen Stevens, who was ambassador over in Korea for a while. And he has a lot of experience in international development on projects funded by the U.S. Agency for International Development, the World Bank, Asian Development Bank, that sort of things. He's fluent in Korean. And for a long time, for more than a decade, he's authored and broadcast a weekly Korean language radio show on Radio Free Asia, broadcast to Asia. It's the Scarlett column. So he's well known there. So we're very happy to have him here today, and I welcome you, Mr. Scarlett.
Larry.
Thank you, Greg.
Larry, thank you so much for the very kind introduction. And thank you so much for putting together this event, which is extraordinarily important in terms of maintaining and promoting peace, prosperity, stability in Korea, Japan, Northeast Asia, and beyond. Let me begin with a disclaimer. Yes, I am an instructor and coordinator of the Japan and Korea seminar at the Foreign Service Institute. However, my views do not reflect the views of FSI or the State Department. I do this as a contractor to McCollum Associates, which is a consulting company that works with FSI. That said, let me say that my very good friend, great American scholar, gentleman, Bruce Klinger, has touched upon most of the main themes pertaining to Korea-Japan relations. Our three countries are natural allies. This trilateral coordination, again, is extraordinarily important to maintaining peace and prosperity in Northeast Asia, the Asia Pacific, and beyond. I keep reminding our Korean friends, and Larry, you told us that your wife is from Japan. Well, we are adopted Americans. I was born and raised in Communist Romania. I'm an American now. My wife is from Korea. I keep telling my good Korean friends that the greatest threat to the Republic of Korea today, our staunch friend, ally, and partner, the Republic of Korea, the greatest threat is not the Japanese Empire of 80 years ago, but the dynastic dictatorship of Kim Jong-un today. That said, history truly matters. And I am going to take the liberty of talking a little bit about history today. Korea has been known, and Koreans basically speak of themselves as the shrimp among the whales, the smaller country surrounded by greater powers. Of course, when whales fight, shrimp get crushed. And for centuries, Japan has regarded Korea as the dagger pointed at the heart of Japan. And China, of course, has regarded Korea as the staging ground of Japanese invasions of China. And there is history to prove that. And of course, I only have a very short time today. Of course, one might look at the first Sino-Japanese War of 1894, 1895, Japan crushed China, Qing Dynasty versus Japan. But we can go back even farther in time. And I would go back to the Japanese invasions of Korea, 1592, 1598. Whenever we talk about current tension over history, of course, what we have in mind is the colonial occupation by Japan, 1905, 1945, but this goes way back. And let me take a minute to dwell upon the Japanese invasions of Korea, 1592, 1598. These were the invasions conducted by Lord Hideyoshi Toyotomi. 1592, 1598, known as the Injin War in Korea, known as the Bunroku no Eki, which was the Japanese era name from 1592 to 1596. Really tough fighting, an invasion of Korea by Japanese forces. Japanese firepower was superior. They were both using firearms, arquebuses. Japanese arms were better. Japanese organization was superior. Korean bureaucracy was quite stifling. Nevertheless, Korean naval power was superior. They had a ship called the Panokson, a powerful galley-type ship, which had the cannons had better range than the Japanese ships. First invasion happened, and second invasion happened in 1597, known as the Cheongju War. And of course, the Trafalgar of Korea is the Battle of Myeongnyang Strait, where Admiral Lee Sun-shin achieved a victory against all odds. 13 Korean ships faced 130 Japanese ships. The Trafalgar of the Koreans, 1597, they sank 30 Japanese ships. Great victory. Had some guerrilla operations in the north, of course, cutting off supply lines. Of course, Chinese troops were there as well. So eventually, the invasion was stopped. But since many of our colleagues today are students and practitioners of both Korea and Japan, let me point out to one particular location in Kyoto, Japan. That is the Mimizuka, the ear mound. It was originally known as the Hanazuka, the nose mound. The practice for Japanese troops was to bring back the heads of slaughtered warriors and civilians. They would be counted, salted, preserved, brought back to Japan, and the daimyo, warlord, would pay the soldiers for their count. So many Koreans were killed during the Hideyoshi invasion, at least 38,000, that they gave up on this practice. Instead, they just brought back ears and noses. They're buried at Mimizuka. There's a small monument. If any of you go to Kyoto, Japan, please look up Mimizuka. So it's a tough history. Again, I deeply and thoroughly appreciate the history of both nations. I was born and raised a Romanian. I'm an American now. I appreciate 500 years of fighting the Ottoman Turks. I think Romanians and Turks came to terms eventually. So did the French and the Germans. So let's hope that the Koreans and the Japanese will do the same. But nevertheless, there's a legacy there. Going to the 19th century, Korea refused to modernize. Japan sent out a group of young scholars and statesmen. They called it the Iwakura Mission. One of the members of the Iwakura Mission would be a Japanese prime minister and governor of occupied, colonized Korea, Ito Hirobumi, would be assassinated by a Korean independence fighter and patriot. Anyway, the Iwakura Mission happened between 1871 and 1873. They visited the entire world, they traveled the globe and came back with conclusions pertaining to the modernization of Japan. By the way, to those of you who live in the greater Washington, D.C. area, there's a small memorial to the Iwakura Mission at the Willard Hotel because that's where they stayed. Japan modernized, Korea didn't. Japan could have become a liberal democracy. It was very close to becoming a liberal democracy, constitutional monarchy. Well, it took the path of imperial occupation. Again, speaking of the dagger, 1894, 1895, they defeated China. Then the Russo-Japanese War happened. Japan became the first Asian power to defeat a Western power, Russia. All of us have to remember the Battle of the Tsushima Strait. The Russian Pacific Fleet was annihilated by the Japanese, who had a very modern fleet at the time. The Russians come up with the idea of bringing the Baltic Fleet all the way around the world to the south of the Horn of Africa. The Japanese meet them at the Tsushima Strait. They run a naval maneuver called crossing the T. You cross in front of the enemy convoy. All of your ships open up on them. All they have is their forward guns. They're obliterated. So basically, to this day, whenever Russian sailors go to the Tsushima Strait, they throw in flowers and cigarettes in memory of the many, many Russian sailors who died on that day. What follows is the Treaty of Portsmouth, 1905. Our own Theodore Rex, President Theodore Roosevelt, earned a Nobel Peace Prize for the Treaty of Portsmouth. Our Korean friends and allies blame us for having abandoned them to the Japanese. I would say that we need a more nuanced view on that. US naval power then was not comparable to the US naval power that we have today. Moreover, the Japanese had a treaty with the Brits, so basically that might have meant being at odds with the Brits. So perhaps we should not be so quick about taking the blame for that. But anyway, the end result of that was that Japan annexed Korea. 1905, de facto annexation. 1910, the de jure annexation for the Japan-Korea Annexation Treaty. This is a very, very tough occupation period for the Koreans. This is a very proud people, 5,000 years of history. Imagine being forced to abandon your own language and use Japanese instead in your schools, in your administration. Imagine having to give up your own name and taking on a Japanese name instead. I remember traveling to temples high up in the mountains in Korea. You can still see iron or steel rods rammed into the entrance to the temples to take away the spirit of the Koreans. So again, it was a very tough period. Okay, the United States defeats the Japanese Empire, the great sacrifice, and we know the story about the separation of the two Koreas. 1965 was a very important year because basically 1965 was the year of the treaty that normalized relations between South Korea and Japan. And pursuant to that treaty, $500 million was dispersed to Korea, South Korea, in grants and loans, and that was extraordinarily helpful in terms of kickstarting what we know today as the Han River Miracle, the extraordinary South Korean economic development. Of course, the compensation was meant for the victims. Compensation was not granted to the victims. Compensation was used by then President Park Chung-hee to develop South Korea's nascent industries. Few today remember that there were those Japanese weekend consultants who traveled to South Korea after 1965 to advise South Korean companies on the economic development of South Korea. And that was a tremendous success story. South Korea was one of the world's poorest countries post-Korean War. Today, it is the world's 10th largest economy. Was there a role that Japan played in that process? Well, certainly. Where do we stand today? Again, we are very natural friends, partners, allies, and yet there are unresolved issues pertaining to this very tough history. Japan will tell you that, well, we had again, I love both. Japan will tell you that we had this 1965 treaty that settled all issues, including compensation to Korean victims of Japanese forced labor and sexual slavery during the Japanese occupation of Korea. Well, there's no such thing as an exclusively legal issue. Lawyers do not rule the world yet. Fortunately, I would say any issue is legal, political, moral, ethical, and emotional. And we watched that great video, courtesy of former Vice Minister Kim Kyung-soo, who mentioned that Korea and Japan are geographically closed, but emotionally far. There is a very strong emotional element important to resolving tensions between Korea and Japan. An excessively legalistic approach tends to ignore that emotional element, which is very, very important. So, our Japanese friends will say, okay, let bygones be bygones. 16 apologies by Japanese prime ministers were issued between September the 7th, 1984, former Prime Minister Nakasone Yasuhiro, and August the 10th, 2010, former Prime Minister Kan Naoto. How many more times do we have to apologize? Our Korean friends and allies will say, indeed. And there has never been a Japanese apology for the crime of aggression. Aggression, the very occupation of Korea, and the very colonization of Korea was a crime. So that's the apology we have been expecting for decades. So again, I'm a friend of both. I have been just a humble student of both for about 31 years. And we as Americans do hope that we will reinforce this trilateral alliance as the main engine driving peace, prosperity, security in Korea, in Japan, Northeast Asia, the Asia Pacific, the Indo-Pacific, and beyond. So Thank you very much for listening. I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'd like to spotlight both of our panelists, and we'll go into discussion. A lot of interesting questions have come in from people. I'd like to start with maybe a point that you ended with Greg, and you talked about how all issues are political, moral, ethical, and emotional seems to rule the day. That's a question, I guess, for both of you. Is the Moon administration's strong emphasis on the comfort women, and I think you can probably count on two hands the number of those comfort women that are still left living. Maybe last time I heard there were between 20 and 40, but that was actually a few years ago. Is that one of the root causes for the increased anger, or is that just something that it's a very easy emotional flag to wave, and comfort women statues have popped up throughout the United States and in Korea? What is the reality of the comfort women issues, I guess, for both of you?
Well, I think Greg captured it quite well. As to sort of paraphrase, I think the Japanese have had an overly legalistic approach to the history issues, and the Koreans have had an overly emotional approach. And there has to be, I think, a mixture of all those components that Greg listed. So, in those stern messages that I referred to that the Obama administration gave, was urging both countries to take steps. So to Japan, it would be, yes, there have been these 16, and I believe, even higher number with other officials, apologies. But they weren't great apologies. They left a lot to be desired. And as any married man would know, you can never stop apologizing for something you've done poorly until the aggrieved one has said enough. I don't mean to be flip about such an important issue. It's something that Japan has to do more to try to address its actions of the past, even though the perpetrators of that have long been deceased. On the other hand, Korea should not always maintain a victim mentality. It should be quite proud of the miracle on the Han, all of the amazing things that such a small country has done. In so many ways, Korea punches above its weight on the global stage. So it should be looking forward rather than to the rear. Now, obviously, difficult issues are hard to just brush aside. But I think there has to be more of a compartmentalizing on the Korean side. And then there has to be more forward-leaning apologies from Japan. Now, the comfort women issue, I think, really is sort of a symbol for all of the many issues during the brutal 1910 and 1945 Japanese occupation. So it's perhaps the most emotional issue, but it really is sort of a proxy for all of the issues that occurred during the occupation. So again, I think it's both sides have done things that were counterproductive to resolving this situation, and both countries still need to do things to try to at least lower the heat on this issue to allow of focusing on the threats of now.
Mm-hmm. Larry and Bruce, these are great points that Bruce made. Sexual slavery is a crime, a war crime. Wartime slavery is a crime. These are crimes. There's no doubt about that. As one who deals with the awful criminal regime of Kim Jong-un in North Korea, this is what I firmly believe. It's a crime now. It was a crime then. Then again, we do need to find a way to escape this conundrum. There's no doubt about it. And unfortunately, these issues have been used and abused by politicians on both sides. We're talking textbooks. This happens in Japan. This happens in Korea. So there is a big territorial dispute, which should not be a territorial dispute. The islets that Koreans refer to as Tokto, The Japanese refer to those islands as Takeshima. We refer to those islets as the Liancourt Rocks in our maps because we want to take sides. Okay, these islets are under South Korean jurisdiction, South Korean Coast Guard. But anyway, I remember President Kim Yong-bak, the predecessor of Park Geun-hye, who late in his administration decided to visit those islets. So if you set the stakes so high when it comes to Korea-Japan tension on such a contentious issue, you know, what's next? So definitely political leaders in both countries have to take it down a few notches, and perhaps we do need to focus on those communities and groups that have affinities developed over decades. And what I have in mind is the business community. I know a lot of Japanese businessmen who deal with Korea, a lot of Korean businessmen who deal with Japan. They're fluent in both languages, and even if they don't state it openly, they even subconsciously take some pride in being part of this community. So maybe we need to defer to the private sector. Maybe we need to defer to those who are interested in cultural exchanges between the two countries. By the way, Bruce, I was an undergraduate student at Seoul National University in 1994. I didn't know much. You were running the world then. But I remember that they wouldn't show Japanese movies in Korean theaters. The first Japanese movie that showed under Kim Dae-jung was Kagemusha, right? Kagemusha. Nifune, right? Oshiro. So, and I say to myself, you know, I grew up in communist Romania. I watched Kagemusha in Romanian theaters and on Romanian TV. And it's really strange that it's just now showing in South Korea. So these cultural exchanges will continue to be important. Remember, Korean K-pop, Korean music, movies are widely popular in Japan. There is a Korean group that's earned about 100,000 followers worldwide, wildly popular in Japan as well. So perhaps we need to focus on that a little bit more. Academic, student exchanges, cultural exchanges, learn from us Americans who once used to know how to do this. We're not as good as we used to be. We still have it. So there is hope, in my opinion.
Yeah. Well, in defense of inadequate apologies, I know that whoever apologizes from Japan has to go back home and get reelected. So they have to deal with that. I want to switch venues here for just a second. Let's talk about China. What has China? China clearly benefits from separation between Japan and Korea. What have they done in the last 2 years to stoke the fires of resentment, to divide Japan and Korea? And are the cyber attacks that come from North Korea against the ROK, do they attack Japan just as much? Either or both?
I'll jump in on the cyber because I've just done a study on it. I've been looking at North Korea for 28 years. Even I was amazed at the extent of North Korean cyber activity when I really got sort of into reviewing my files and data. I knew they had done the cyber. I'd done interviews on it. But I hadn't realized in the last several years the extent of their activity. So North Korea, their initial attacks were on South Korea, and it was a lot of espionage and causing problems, distributed denial of service attacks. They've gone through a number of phases where it's now the latest is sort of going after pharmaceuticals to try to get COVID vaccine information. Before that, it was and continuing to be a lot of money-making operations. They can make a lot more money, a lot more efficiently with less risk by doing cyber bank robbery or cryptocurrency robbery than they can through sort of their bricks and mortar kind of criminal activity. Japan certainly is not exempt from North Korean cyber activity. They've gone after cryptocurrency sites in Japan. One, I think they hit for $232 million, et cetera. So, perhaps the early targets were exclusively or primarily South Korea, but North Korea now targets anyone. And right now the focus has been more on money making perhaps than cyber, but they retain, or than espionage, but they retain that capability. On other issues, China may not have had to do much to try to stoke the animosity between Tokyo and Seoul, because both countries are doing quite a good job of that themselves. What I think China has been doing more of is intimidating each ally, as well as other countries throughout Southeast Asia, sort of a don't get in our way, or don't get at odds with us. So just as we saw when South Korea finally deployed a US missile defense system that was far better than anything South Korea had or will have for decades, China retaliated economically, massive economic boycotts of South Korean firms. That has made South Korea very wary about criticizing China by name. So China is trying to throw its weight around, trying to get other countries to either acquiesce to its demands, territorial and other, or just to remain quiet. And as the famous phrase says, the only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. So I think that was one reason why President Moon was less forthcoming than Prime Minister Suga during the summit statements.
I see, Greg.
Well, certainly Japan and South Korea, the two strong anchors of the US alliance system in Asia. We must be able to work together. We must be able to promote this trilateral cooperation in order to present a united front against China and, of course, North Korea. Now, China will always exploit divisions among the three partners. Mm-hmm. And for this very reason, the very simple statement would be that resolving the dispute between Japan and South Korea should be a high priority for any US administration. I don't think the previous administration was very successful in addressing this. Of course, it's very difficult topic, and there's this tendency not to get involved. But nevertheless, the United States can play a very important role. The current administration of President Biden actually spoke about the two pillars of U.S. foreign policy even before the presidential elections: shared values and multilateralism. So I think that working on mending these disputes and building bridges between our two allies would play out very nice, will play right into an effort to enforce and reinforce a rules-based order in the Indo-Pacific. And these, again, are our greatest allies.
I had a younger brother and an older brother, so I got pretty good at let's you and him fight. And so I have a question about, new. It's not new. In fact, it's been around for a long time, but it's new in the news. So it's just kind of a trendy thing. People talking about the Quad of India, Australia, US, and Japan as a new kind of quadrilateral alliance. And how does that affect US ROK Japan alliance? Has Japan found new friends, or does it isolate Korea, or what goes on here, and how does that affect China?
Well, the Quad has actually been around for a little while, and it was sort of it was one of the initiatives of Shinzo Abe when he was prime minister. It's gotten more energy, more attention, more vigor recently. So China will depict it as an anti-China coalition that's trying to contain and subjugate China. That's not the case. Originally, the focus of the Quad was almost non-security issues. A lot of, where can those four nations, which include Japan, work together on addressing regional issues, economic and health, et cetera, transnational crime, et cetera. under the Trump administration, they were trying to sort of go along. Well, let me take a step back. Given the COVID situation and how China covered it up, and we don't know the origin of it, but in any case, we know China covered up, the initial parts of it. That led to great anger in the public, the U.S. Congress, both political parties, against China, given the huge economic and societal cost of COVID. That brought to the forefront a lot of issues that experts on Asia had long known about, the activity of both China and business practices, East, South China Sea, Taiwan, et cetera. But it brought new attention to it. And people were like, yeah, I didn't know they were doing that. Let's beat up on them. The Trump administration's approach was kind of you're with us or you're against us. Join this coalition to beat up on China for various reasons. The Biden administration, I think, is still going to be pushing multilateralism, but not so much you're with us or against us. So the Quad is one method of trying to coalesce democracies in Asia towards upholding the values and principles that we share, and then defending against those, most likely China, that are threatening them. So South Korea has been very reluctant to join the Quad because it's afraid of Chinese retaliation. So in the joint statement with President Biden, Moon sort of praised the Quad. At the same time, Seoul has been resisting joining it because they're afraid of what retaliation by China. So it's not meant to be an anti-Chinese coalition, but it's a way of trying to advocate and then defend the common values and principles that democracies share.
Okay.
And certainly political will is extraordinarily important, as Bruce pointed out. This might be a little bit easier under a conservative administration in South Korea. We don't want to play politics here, that's fine. A progressive administration can be persuaded as well. After all, this is a free, democratic ally of the United States. Once the political will is there, of course, there will be some technical issues that come into play. South Korea, Bruce knows this much better, of course, but South Korea does not necessarily have a significant blue water navy. Of course, they participated in some operations in the Gulf of Aden and so on and so forth. I don't know if I want to say brown water, but nevertheless a littoral navy. So some other decisions will have to be made in order for South Korea to become a significant player as part of the Quad. But one can only be very hopeful. These are great allies, partners, and friends.
Break out your crystal balls, both of you. Will Prime Minister Suga be reelected, and will President Moon be reelected in Korea? Bruce?
Well, I'll take the South Korean thing, and I'll leave the Japanese one to Greg.
You're taking the easy one, Bruce.
Yeah.
I'm doing that, Greg. Sorry, buddy. I can 100% guarantee that President Moon will not be reelected because the Constitution only allows South Korean presidents to serve a single 5-year term. So no South Korean.
No, but his party.
Oh,
Not him, his party. And as we say in America, it depends on who counts the votes. But,
right. Yeah. Darn it, you made it harder now. I think in Korean politics, and I'm sure in Japanese politics, there's a phrase of, a week ahead is a long time, and the future is dark.
It's a lifetime in America too.
The conservatives in South Korea seemed, they were defeated, they were demoralized, they were criticized strongly when Park Geun-hye was impeached. And it seemed like there was no way that they were going to be able to come back from that, even 5 years later. But in recent elections, very important city elections of Seoul and Busan, President Moon's party did quite poorly and the conservatives did quite well. So that is giving hope to the conservatives. But I think what the voters would probably caution the opposition Conservative Party is, it wasn't really so much a vote of support for you. It was a vote of opposition to or criticism to Moon. So I think it's a year away. It's really a tough. Suga, I think, is going to run for re-election. His popularity has plummeted. A lot of it is going to depend on the Olympics, which I think will be quite disappointing as well as whether Japan is,
Attendance wise?
well, just it's not going to be the huge burst of support that would have buoyed prime minister when it was, when the city was awarded. So it's not going to give the bump up that Suga or anyone else would have wanted. So there's, I think, Japanese politics to me is even more confusing than South Korean politics, which is saying a lot. So I think Suga will try to be reelected. At this point, I'd give him a better than even chance, but we'll see.
Greg, do you concur?
I think that's a great point about the mayoral elections in South Korea. The conservative opposition won both Seoul and Busan. Busan was not too much of a surprise. That's the main power base, the Gyeongsang province, the main power base of conservatives. Seoul was a bit of a surprise. It's, of course, too soon to tell. We have almost a year to go, as Bruce said. But I do think that President Moon Jae-in is having some trouble. The economy is sputtering, partially due to his own economic policies, of course, partially due to COVID, moms and pop shops being shut down all over the place. Even larger corporations having trouble with supply chain issues and everything else. So things are not looking up really for President Moon Jae-in. But then again, Korean politics goes in 10-year cycles. So the normal expectation would be for the progressives to win another cycle. We'll see how that plays out. Prime Minister Suga Yoshihide. Bruce and I know him. I've done so many events with him while he was the Chief Cabinet Secretary and Minister for Abductions. He's a real street fighter. He does not come from the pedigree of a multi-generational politician and leader and corporate leader. He really, really knows his stuff, and he was the man behind the success of Prime Minister Abe. So I will never, ever discount the chances of Prime Minister Suga Yoshihide. Let me be a bomb thrower here.
All righty.
Prime Minister Abe stepped down for health reasons. What if he ever considered coming back? Of course, Prime Minister Abe was in office for a very long time. We know how the LDP works in Japan. There's a very long line of candidates who are waiting and waiting and waiting. And yes, Prime Minister Abe was still there. So this makes the situation really complicated and really interesting, I want to say. So regardless of the result, these are democracies. They're our friends, our allies, our partners. They're different. They're very modern countries and wonderful countries. They're not, I'm stating the obvious, not Western countries. So we'll follow closely, see how things turn out. And regardless of how things turn out, we do hope that the outcome will continue to reinforce our tripartite coordination in our alliances.
Okay. One more question, and then I'm going to ask each of you to wrap up with another brief question. This is along the same line, this final question. The meeting of Prime Minister Suga with President Biden yielded a strong statement for alliance and firm resistance to China in the South China Sea. What do you think of the Biden-President Moon summit? Do you think Biden wanted a stronger commitment from President Moon than he got regarding, his willingness to stand with America?
Yes. There's been reporting that the Biden administration was hoping for a clearer criticism of China by name. But if you look at the joint statement, it really is pretty amazing in its depth and breadth. There were a lot of issues covered, economic promises and promises to cooperate on COVID. The U.S. promised 500,000 and then 1 million vaccines to the South Korean military and retirees, and I think that will continue. On alliance issues, there were some compromises. I think each side's, and the same with North Korea. There was some each side can point to things that it looked like they got from the other side. So we don't know if that was a meeting of the minds or just a compromise. So, but I think on the sort of free and open Indo-Pacific, the US, I think, was looking for a stronger statement from South Korea. And South Korea is trying to straddle the fence. They, on the one hand, they'll say how this was the first time South Korea has mentioned Taiwan and you know, took a very bold step forward. And yet after the summit, after the delegation had gone back to Seoul, the foreign minister and the first vice foreign minister were sort of like, we didn't talk about specifics. We didn't mention China. We think Beijing will be very appreciative that we didn't mention it. So sort of extolling the boldness of the step, but then also subsequently downplaying it. So yeah, a little disappointing from the Washington side.
Okay, Greg.
I think it was a very good step, a strong step toward mending some, you know, broken relationships. We had some issues for quite a few years. It was a very solid statement. And it was a very solid statement. And let me place this within my own scope of work, a statement that even addressed North Korean human rights. So let's give it to the State Department for having included that in the list of topics that were addressed by the two leaders. So I think I'm very optimistic about the state and fate of U.S. Republic of Korea relations moving forward based on this statement.
Okay. Now, one question, 1 minute each from each of you. And what I look for from my president is bold, inventive statecraft. And what advice could you give to President Biden on strengthening the Trilateral Alliance? Bruce?
We have to extol publicly the importance of both of our allies. They have different capabilities, they have different roles, but we need to publicly praise them, publicly show to the American people how important they are to us. Privately, we can be stern and direct in our suggestions to both allies to move forward on the history issue. So as you do with your children or your friends, you publicly praise and criticize in private.
Okay, Greg?
Being so keen on both shared values and multilateralism, we have to be aware that we face very strong revisionist powers that are trying to take down the international system as we know it. Both the Republic of Korea and Japan are true democracies, economic powerhouses, strong friends, allies, and partners of the United States. They need to join us in this effort to maintain, preserve the international system that we have led for so many decades. Is it perfect? No. Has it let us down? Yes. But is there a better alternative in place? Absolutely not. So we need them to help us preserve this international system. We need them to help us improve it, make it better, and continue to maintain a drive towards peace, prosperity, democracy, human rights, because these are truly the human rights that we cherish. I'm a very strong proponent of value-centered alliances. If we take the values out of our alliances, what is left? What makes us better, let me say it, than the Russians or the Chinese?
That is excellent, excellent. This conversation has been amazing and stimulating. I'm so happy you gentlemen responded positively. I love both countries to the core of my being and could happily live in either one of them until my last dying day. As we close, I'd like to invite Dr. Michael Jenkins, who's our chairman of Universal Peace Federation USA, and also president of the Washington Times Foundation, to just say a word of greeting. And can we pin him to the screen, EJ? There we go.
Thank you. Thank you, Larry, for an excellent program, and to Bruce and Greg. Very, very stimulating and very also quite interesting. And we're hoping for better trilateral relations. And I think your advice to the Biden administration is very, very reasonable and very important. Tomorrow morning, we're having a session with Ambassador Christopher Hill, Ambassador Detrani, and several other key panelists, and many of your colleagues are coming on the next couple days. So we really appreciate your leadership for advising our government and the other governments of Japan and ROK. And we look forward to seeing more collaboration and even open dialogue with China, Russia, and North Korea as we go forward. So we're very hopeful. We're pleased that the Biden administration is standing stronger than it looked like right in the beginning. So thank you very much for your leadership. And thank you, Larry, for this.
Thank you. Thank you. And again, to our panelists and Bruce and Greg, if you want to watch any of the rest of the conference, just come back on the link that we gave you. You can hang out backstage with us and we'll just chill. Thank you very much. God bless you guys. Drive safe.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Okay.